The rain was so loud that night it drowned out the sound of a daughter's heart breaking. My name is Sarah Bennett, and 10 years ago, I stood on the front porch of the only home I had ever known while a cold spring storm swept across our small town of Cedar Creek. The rain soaked through my jacket within seconds. Water dripped from my hair and ran down my face, mixing with tears I desperately tried to hide. Across the street, porch lights flickered on as curious neighbors peeked through their windows. In a town as small as ours, nothing remained private for long, especially not a family falling apart. My suitcase sat beside me on the wet porch boards. Everything I owned fit inside that single bag. A few changes of clothes, some school books, a framed photograph of my father and me taken years before he passed away. I was 18 years old, and for the first time in my life, I had nowhere to go. Behind me stood my mother, Linda Bennett. Her face was pale and tense. The argument that brought us to this moment had started hours earlier at the dinner table. What began as another disagreement about my future quickly grew into something much larger. Since my father died 3 years before, nothing in our home felt the same. Financial pressures increased. Tempers became shorter. Conversations turned into arguments. We seemed unable to understand each other anymore. That evening, I told my mother I had been accepted into a business program in Chicago. It was an opportunity one had worked for throughout high school. I thought she would be proud. Instead, she became angry. She insisted I stay in Cedar Creek and help support the family. I argued that leaving was my chance to build a better future. Neither of us backed down. The argument escalated until words were spoken that neither of us could take back. Then came the sentence that changed everything. If you care more about leaving than about your family, then maybe you should leave right now. At first, I thought she did not mean it. Mothers said things in anger. People calmed down. Life moved on. But my mother simply stood there staring at me. The silence that followed hurt more than the words themselves. Slowly, I packed my suitcase. Part of me expected her to stop me, to apologize, to tell me to stay. Instead, she remained silent. And now here I was, standing outside while rain hammered the roof above us. "Mom," I whispered one last time. "Please." For a brief moment, something flickered in her eyes. Regret, fear, sadness. I could not tell. But whatever she was feeling, she kept it hidden. Without another word, she stepped backward. The front door slowly closed. Then it locked. The sound echoed through my chest like a final goodbye. I stood frozen on the porch for several seconds. Across the street, a neighbor pulled her curtain closed. Another porch light went dark. The entire neighborhood had witnessed my humiliation. Eventually, I picked up my suitcase and began walking. The rain grew heavier as I moved down the empty street. Every step carried me farther from the life I had known. I had no plan, no apartment, no savings worth mentioning. Just a bus ticket purchased months earlier and $11 folded inside my wallet. Yet somewhere beneath the fear, another feeling began to emerge. Determination. If nobody believed in me, then I would have to believe in myself. As I reached the edge of town, I stopped and looked back one final time. The house stood quietly beneath the storm clouds. The porch light remained on. For a moment, I wondered whether the front door might open and whether my mother might come running after me. It never happened. So I turned around and walked into the darkness, unaware that the next 10 years would change not only my life, but the entire town that had watched me leave on that rainy night. The bus station smelled like coffee, wet pavement, and exhaustion. I arrived just before midnight with my suitcase still damp from the rain. The fluorescent lights above flickered softly while a handful of travelers sat scattered across the waiting area. Most of them looked like they knew exactly where they were going. I was not one of them. I purchased a one-way ticket to Chicago months earlier after receiving my acceptance letter, never imagining I would actually need it under these circumstances. At the time, buying the ticket felt like preparing for a dream. Now it felt like preparing for survival. I sat alone near the window and counted my money for the third time. $11. That was all I had after purchasing the ticket. The realization made my stomach tighten with fear. Yet turning back was no longer an option. By sunrise, Cedar Creek would be behind me. Several hours later, the bus finally arrived. I found a seat near the back and watched the town slowly disappear through rain-streaked glass. Familiar streets passed by. The grocery store where I worked part-time during high school. The diner where my father used to take me for pancakes every Saturday morning. The church where our family attended services for years. One by one, they vanished into the darkness. When the bus reached the highway, I closed my eyes and silently promised myself something. No matter how difficult life became, I would never return as the frightened girl leaving town with a suitcase and broken heart. I would return only after building a life I could be proud of. The trip lasted nearly 12 hours. By the time Chicago appeared on the horizon, I felt emotionally exhausted. The skyline seemed enormous compared to anything I had ever known. Towering buildings stretched toward the clouds. Endless traffic filled the roads. Thousands of strangers moved in every direction. The city felt exciting and terrifying at the same time. For the first few days, I stayed in a low-cost hostel near downtown. The room was small and shared with several other young women chasing dreams of their own. I quickly learned that every dollar mattered. Breakfast often consisted of a bagel and water. Lunch was whatever I could afford. Some days I skipped meals entirely to save money. My acceptance into the business program gave me access to classes, but tuition payments and living expenses remained overwhelming challenges. I spent every available hour searching for work. Rejection became a daily routine. Restaurants were not hiring. Retail stores wanted experienced employees. Office positions required qualifications I did not yet possess. Each rejection chipped away at my confidence. There were nights when I sat alone in the hostel staring at the ceiling, wondering whether my mother had been right. Maybe leaving had been a mistake. Maybe I was not strong enough for this life. Then I would remember standing on that porch in the rain while the front door closed behind me. The memory always pushed me forward. After nearly 3 weeks, I finally secured a job cleaning offices during the evening. The pay was modest, but it was enough to help cover basic expenses. During the day, I attended classes. At night, I emptied trash bins, vacuumed carpets, and cleaned conference rooms after business executives went home. Most nights, I returned to the hostel after midnight completely exhausted. Still, I kept going. Slowly, life settled into a difficult but manageable routine. Then one afternoon, while reviewing assignments in the campus library, I noticed a business networking event posted on a bulletin board. Successful entrepreneurs would be speaking to students about careers and leadership. Normally, I would have ignored it. I barely had enough confidence to introduce myself to strangers. Yet something about that flyer caught my attention. I could not explain why. Looking back now, that simple decision to attend a single event would become one of the most important choices of my entire life. The networking event took place on a Thursday evening inside a large conference room overlooking downtown Chicago. I almost turned around twice before walking through the doors. Everyone there seemed confident and successful. Students wore professional clothing and exchanged business cards as if they had been preparing for this moment their entire lives. I stood near the back of the room, feeling completely out of place. My shoes were worn from months of walking between classes and work. My blazer came from a thrift store. More than once, I wondered whether I should simply leave. Then the guest speaker stepped onto the stage. His name was Richard Collins, founder of a rapidly growing logistics company. He spent nearly an hour talking about failure, persistence, and opportunity. What surprised me most was how often he spoke about setbacks. Instead of presenting himself as someone who had always succeeded, he described years of mistakes and disappointments before finding success. For the first time since arriving in Chicago, I heard someone describe a journey that sounded similar to my own struggles. After the presentation ended, students gathered around him asking questions. I waited until the crowd thinned before introducing myself. My voice shook slightly as I thanked him for sharing his story. To my surprise, he asked about mine. I briefly explained where I came from, my business studies, and the evening job that helped me stay enrolled. He listened carefully without interrupting. Before leaving, he handed me his business card. "Keep working hard," he said. "People who refuse to quit are harder to find than people with talent." Those words stayed with me for weeks. A month later, I received an unexpected email. Richard remembered our conversation and offered me a temporary internship at his company. The position paid very little, and I would need to continue cleaning offices at night, but I accepted immediately. My schedule became exhausting. Classes filled my mornings. The internship occupied my afternoons. Cleaning offices consumed most evenings. Sleep became a luxury. There were days when I felt completely drained. Yet I also felt something new beginning to grow inside me. Confidence. For the first time, I could see a path forward. At the company, I volunteered for every project possible. I stayed late whenever needed. I asked questions. I took notes. I studied how successful people made decisions. While many interns focused only on completing assignments, I try to understand the bigger picture behind every task. Richard noticed. Several months later, he invited me to assist with a small operational project. It was not glamorous work, but it gave me a chance to prove myself. I worked on the project every spare minute I had. When the results exceeded expectations, additional opportunities followed. Slowly, people began trusting me with greater responsibilities. Life improved, but not everything became easier. During those years, loneliness remained a constant companion. Holidays were often the hardest. While classmates traveled home to spend time with family, I usually stayed in the city working extra shifts. Sometimes I walked past brightly decorated apartment windows and wondered what my mother was doing back in Cedar Creek. I wondered whether she ever thought about me. I wondered whether she regretted what happened that night. Despite those thoughts, I never reached out. Too much pain remained between us. Instead, I focused on building the future I promised myself. By the time I graduated, I had earned excellent grades and secured a full-time position with Richard's company. It felt like a major victory, but I quickly learned that success was not a destination. It was simply the beginning of a much longer journey. One evening, as I prepared to leave the office, Richard called me into his conference room. He placed a folder on the table and smiled. Inside was a proposal unlike anything I had ever seen before. As I began reading the documents, I realized the opportunity in front of me could change the course of my entire life. The proposal inside the folder outlined a new expansion initiative that Richard planned to launch across several Midwestern states. The company needed someone to coordinate operations between multiple locations, manage vendor relationships, and help develop new systems for a rapidly growing network. The position carried more responsibility than anything I had ever handled before. It also included a salary that seemed almost impossible to believe. For a moment, I simply stared at the numbers on the page. Just a few years earlier, I had been counting every dollar to afford food and rent. Now I was being offered an opportunity that could completely transform my future. Richard leaned back in his chair and watched my reaction. "I know it is a big step," he said, "but I would not offer it if I did not believe you were ready." His confidence meant more to me than the promotion itself. Throughout my journey in Chicago, there had been many moments when I doubted myself. Yet somehow he always seemed able to see potential before I could see it. I accepted the position that same afternoon. The following months became some of the busiest of my life. I traveled constantly between offices, warehouses, and distribution centers. Some weeks I spent more time in airports than in my own apartment. Every challenge taught me something new. I learned how to negotiate contracts, solve logistical problems, manage teams, and make decisions under pressure. Mistakes still happened, but I no longer allowed failures to define me. Instead, I treated them as lessons. Slowly, my confidence grew stronger. 3 years passed. Then 4. The frightened 18-year-old who arrived in Chicago with $11 in her wallet felt like someone I barely recognized. Financial stability finally arrived. I moved into a comfortable apartment overlooking the river. I no longer worried about whether I could pay bills or afford groceries. For the first time, I had savings, investments, and long-term plans. Yet despite the success, something always felt incomplete. Every time I achieved a new milestone, part of me wished I could tell my father about it. And no matter how much time passed, thoughts of Cedar Creek occasionally returned. Sometimes I searched for photographs of the town online. Sometimes I wondered whether the old house still looked the same. I never contacted anyone. The distance remained easier than reopening old wounds. One evening, after a long business trip, Richard invited me to dinner. During the meal, he surprised me once again. He announced that he planned to retire within the next several years and wanted to begin preparing new leadership for future ventures. Then he asked a question that left me speechless. Had I ever considered starting my own company? At first, the idea seemed impossible. Building a business from the ground up required enormous risk. Yet the more we talked, the more the possibility began to feel real. Richard explained that many of the skills I had developed over the years could easily translate into entrepreneurship. More importantly, he reminded me of something I had nearly forgotten. Courage had changed my life once before. Perhaps it could do so again. For months, I researched markets, developed business plans, and analyzed opportunities. Every spare evening became devoted to preparation. Eventually, after countless spreadsheets, meetings, and sleepless nights, I made the decision. I launched my own consulting firm focused on logistics and operational efficiency. The first year was terrifying. Clients were difficult to secure. Revenue fluctuated unpredictably. Several times I questioned whether I had made a terrible mistake. But persistence once again became my greatest asset. One client became three. Three became 10. Referrals generated new opportunities. The company grew faster than I imagined possible. 5 years after its founding, the business employed dozens of people and operated across multiple states. Then, on an ordinary Tuesday morning, an email arrived that immediately caught my attention. A regional development committee was seeking proposals for a major revitalization project in a small town called Cedar Creek. The moment I read the name, everything seemed to stop. After 10 years, fate was quietly opening a door back to the place I had once vowed never to see again. For several minutes, I simply stared at the email on my computer screen. Cedar Creek. The name carried a weight that 10 years had never managed to erase. Memories flooded back instantly. The old streets. The small downtown square. The front porch where my life changed forever. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. Part of me wanted to delete the message and move on. Another part could not ignore the opportunity sitting directly in front of me. The Regional Development Committee was seeking a private consulting firm to lead a major revitalization effort designed to attract new businesses, create jobs, and modernize infrastructure throughout the area. It was exactly the type of project my company specialized in. Professionally, it made perfect sense to submit a proposal. Personally, it felt far more complicated. For several days, I avoided making a decision. I reviewed project details repeatedly. I studied economic reports. I analyzed budgets and forecasts. Yet every time I reached the final page, my thoughts returned to the same question. Was I ready to go back? Eventually, I scheduled a meeting with my executive team. We spent hours discussing the opportunity. The numbers were promising. The scope was significant. The project had the potential to become one of the most important contracts our company had ever pursued. My team unanimously recommended moving forward. None of them knew the town's connection to my past. To them, Cedar Creek was simply another business opportunity. To me, it was unfinished history. That evening, I walked along the river after work, hoping fresh air would clear my mind. As city lights reflected across the water, I thought about the promise I made to myself on the bus 10 years earlier. I had sworn never to return until I built a life I could be proud of. Standing there now, I realized something. I had already accomplished that goal. The frightened teenager who left with $11 no longer existed. I had built a career. I had built a company. I had built a future. Whether Cedar Creek accepted me or not no longer mattered. For the first time, I felt ready. The next morning, I authorized the proposal. Over the following weeks, my team worked tirelessly preparing presentations, financial models, and development plans. Every detail had to be perfect. We proposed new business partnerships, workforce training programs, infrastructure improvements, and community investment strategies designed to help small towns compete in a rapidly changing economy. Months later, we received the news. Our firm had been selected. The contract was ours. I sat quietly in my office after reading the notification. While my staff celebrated outside, I found myself staring through the window at the Chicago skyline. In a few months, I would be returning to Cedar Creek for the first time in a decade. The realization felt both exciting and unsettling. As preparations moved forward, local newspapers began reporting on the upcoming project. The development committee released statements describing the investment initiative, but very little information was shared about the consulting company leading it. The identity of the firm's founder remained largely unknown to residents. That anonymity provided a strange sense of comfort. Back in Cedar Creek, people discussed the project constantly. New jobs, new businesses, new opportunities. The entire town seemed eager to learn who was behind the investment. Meanwhile, I focused on logistics. Travel arrangements were finalized. Meetings were scheduled. Construction assessments were planned. Every step brought the date closer. Then, 2 weeks before my departure, something unexpected happened. While reviewing historical property records related to the project, I came across an address I immediately recognized. It was my childhood home. Curiosity got the better of me. I searched recent public records and discovered that the property remained in my mother's name. She still lived there. For several long moments, I stared at the screen. 10 years had passed, yet somehow the thought of seeing that house again unsettled me more than any business challenge I had ever faced. Little did I know, the town was preparing for a surprise. But the biggest surprise of all was still waiting just beyond the city limits of Cedar Creek. The drive back to Cedar Creek felt much shorter than the journey that had taken me away 10 years earlier. Perhaps it was because I no longer traveled with fear. This time, I traveled with purpose. My company had rented a black sport utility vehicle for the trip, and several members of my leadership team followed behind in separate vehicles carrying project materials and presentation equipment. As the miles passed beneath the tires, familiar landscapes slowly began to emerge. Rolling fields stretched across the horizon. Old farmhouses stood beside country roads. Small towns appeared and disappeared along the highway. Every landmark seemed to pull another memory from the past. By the time the welcome sign for Cedar Creek came into view, my heart was beating faster than I cared to admit. The town looked both familiar and different. Some buildings had been renovated. Others showed signs of age. Yet the overall feeling remained the same. It was still the place where I spent my childhood. It was still the place where my life changed forever. We arrived 2 days before the official public announcement of the development project. The committee had arranged private meetings with local leaders, business owners, and community representatives. Because most residents still did not know who owned the consulting firm, I moved through the early meetings with relatively little attention. A few people recognized my last name when introductions were made, but none seemed to connect it to the teenager who had left a decade earlier. 10 years changes a person in ways photographs cannot fully capture. That evening, I checked into a small hotel near downtown. After dinner, I found myself unable to sleep. The memories were too strong. Around 9 o'clock, I decided to take a drive through town. The streets were quiet. Porch lights glowed softly against the evening sky. Families sat on front patios enjoying the warm weather. As I turned onto Maple Street, my chest tightened. There it was. My childhood home. The house looked older than I remembered. The paint had faded slightly. The flower beds were smaller. Yet it was unmistakably the same place. I parked across the street and sat silently behind the wheel. Light shined through the front window. Someone was home. My mother. For several minutes, I considered walking to the door. Then I imagined the conversation that might follow and realized I was not ready. Not yet. Instead, I watched quietly before driving away. The next morning, preparations for the public meeting intensified. Local newspapers announced that representatives from the development firm would finally appear before the community. Excitement spread throughout Cedar Creek. Business owners hoped for new opportunities. Residents discussed possible improvements. The entire town seemed curious about the mysterious company investing millions of dollars into their future. By late afternoon, people began gathering inside the community center. Every seat was filled. Additional chairs were brought in. Reporters prepared cameras and notebooks. Committee members organized presentation materials near the stage. Outside, more residents continued arriving. No one realized that among the names listed on the evening agenda was a woman many believed they would never see again. Back at the hotel, I stood in front of the mirror preparing for the event. My tailored navy suit represented years of work, sacrifice, and determination. Yet despite all my accomplishments, I suddenly felt like the 18-year-old girl standing in the rain once more. I took a deep breath and reminded myself why I was there. Not for revenge, not for validation. I was there because I had earned my place through hard work and perseverance. An hour later, our vehicles pulled into the parking lot. Through the crowd gathering outside, I noticed several familiar faces from years ago. Former neighbors, former teachers, people who had witnessed my departure. As the black sport utility vehicle came to a stop and the door opened, hundreds of eyes turned toward the woman stepping out. And in that instant, the first whispers of recognition began spreading through the crowd. The whispers spread faster than I could have imagined. At first, only a few people recognized me. Then another person looked closer. Then another. Within moments, dozens of conversations were happening simultaneously throughout the parking lot. I heard my name more than once as I walked toward the entrance of the community center. Some voices sounded surprised. Others sounded confused. A few seemed unable to believe what they were seeing. 10 years earlier, many of these same people had watched me leave town carrying a single suitcase through a storm. Now they were staring at me as I stepped from a vehicle surrounded by executives, consultants, and project managers. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Inside the building, the atmosphere felt electric. Every seat was occupied. Residents stood along the walls. Local reporters adjusted cameras and prepared for interviews. Community leaders exchanged greetings while scanning the room for the mysterious investor they had heard so much about. When the development committee chairperson finally approached the microphone, the crowd gradually quieted. He welcomed everyone and spoke about the future of Cedar Creek. New jobs, new opportunities, new investments. The audience listened attentively. Then he reached the moment everyone had been waiting for. He began introducing the leadership team responsible for the project. One by one, members of my company were invited to stand. Polite applause followed each introduction. Finally, he smiled and turned toward me. And now I would like to introduce the founder and chief executive officer of the firm leading this initiative. The room became completely silent. I stood and walked toward the stage. The moment my face appeared on the large projection screens beside the podium, an audible reaction swept through the audience. Some people gasped. Others stared in disbelief. A few covered their mouths with their hands. The recognition was immediate. Cedar Creek had expected a corporate executive from another city. Instead, they were looking at someone who once lived just a few blocks away. As I reached the microphone, my eyes moved across the audience. Former teachers sat near the front. Old classmates occupied several rows near the center. Neighbors from Maple Street were scattered throughout the room. Then I saw her. My mother sat quietly near the back. Time seemed to stop. 10 years had changed both of us. Her hair contained more gray than I remembered. Her posture appeared slightly more fragile. Yet I recognized her instantly. She looked as stunned as everyone else. For a brief moment, neither of us looked away. Then I turned my attention back to the presentation. The next 30 minutes passed in a blur. I explained our vision for economic growth. I described infrastructure improvements, workforce programs, and partnerships designed to strengthen the community. Professionally, everything went exactly as planned. Yet beneath every slide and every statistic, I remained aware of hundreds of eyes watching me. Many were not studying the project. They were trying to reconcile the successful business leader standing on stage with the teenager they remembered from years ago. After the presentation ended, the audience rose to its feet in applause. The reaction surprised me, not because of professional pride, but because I suddenly realized how far I had come. The girl who once doubted whether she could survive in a new city was now helping shape the future of an entire community. As people began approaching the stage, conversations erupted throughout the room. Residents asked questions. Business owners requested meetings. Reporters sought interviews. Everywhere I turned, familiar faces appeared. Some offered congratulations. Others expressed amazement. A few admitted they never expected to see me return. Through it all, I remained polite and professional. I had not come back seeking revenge or validation. Success had already given me something far more valuable than either of those things. It had given me peace. Eventually, as the crowd thinned, I looked toward the back of the room again. My mother was gone. Her chair sat empty. A strange disappointment settled over me. Part of me had hoped she might stay. Part of me wanted answers after all these years. As I prepared to leave, one of the committee members approached with a small envelope. "A woman asked me to give this to you," he said. My heart immediately knew who it was from. I stared at the envelope for several seconds before opening it. Inside was a handwritten note containing only one sentence. "There is something you never knew about that night, and I think it is finally time for you to hear the truth." I sat alone in my hotel room long after the community center had emptied. The handwritten note rested on the table in front of me. I had read the sentence at least 20 times, yet it still felt impossible to process. For 10 years, I believed I understood exactly what happened that rainy night. We argued. My mother chose her position. I left. End of story. But now she was telling me there had been something else. Something I never knew. The following morning, another envelope arrived at the hotel reception desk. This one contained an address and a time. Nothing more. The address led to a small lakeside park on the edge of town. The meeting was scheduled for 6 o'clock that evening. Throughout the day, I attended project meetings and site visits, but my concentration was nowhere near where it should have been. Every conversation eventually drifted back to the same question. What truth could possibly justify 10 years of silence? As evening approached, I drove alone to the park. The sun was beginning to set when I arrived. The lake reflected shades of orange and gold across its calm surface. Near a wooden bench overlooking the water sat my mother. For a moment, neither of us moved. The years between us felt enormous. Then I slowly walked forward and sat beside her. Silence settled over us. It was not an angry silence. It was the silence of two people carrying the weight of a decade. Finally, my mother spoke. "You look so much like your father." The simple statement nearly broke my composure. It had been years since anyone mentioned him that way. We talked cautiously at first. Questions about health, work, life, safe subjects. Then, eventually, the conversation reached the reason we were there. My mother took a deep breath and stared across the lake. "You always believed I wanted you gone," she said quietly. "The truth is much more complicated." She explained that several months before our argument, serious financial problems had begun threatening our family. After my father's death, debts that he had quietly managed became increasingly difficult to control. Bills accumulated faster than income. Mortgage payments fell behind. Collection notices arrived regularly. My mother worked tirelessly to keep everything together, but the pressure became overwhelming. Still, none of that explained why she told me to leave. Then she revealed the part one never expected. A few weeks before I received my acceptance letter, she learned that the house would likely be lost if the financial situation did not improve. The possibility of foreclosure terrified her. She worried constantly about what would happen if I remained in Cedar Creek. In her mind, staying would trap me inside the same struggles consuming her own life. "When you told me about Chicago, I was proud of you," she said softly. "More proud than you will ever know." I stared at her in disbelief. Every memory I carried told a completely different story. Tears appeared in her eyes. But I was also afraid. If I encouraged you to leave, I knew you would refuse because of me. You would stay and try to help. You always put family first. The realization hit me slowly. She had known exactly what I would do. She was right. At 18 years old, I absolutely would have sacrificed my opportunity if I believed my mother needed me. My chest tightened as she continued. The argument that night was real. The emotions were real. But the final decision had been influenced by something she never told me. She believed forcing me away was the only way to guarantee I pursued the future I deserved. "I thought you would hate me," she whispered. "But I also thought one day you would build the life I always wanted for you." Tears rolled down her face. For the first time in 10 years, I saw not the mother who pushed me away, but the frightened widow who had been struggling alone after my father's death. The woman sitting beside me had spent an entire decade carrying her own heartbreak. And as the sun disappeared below the horizon, I realized there was still one question neither of us had answered. After all these years, could we truly forgive each other? For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The lake remained calm as evening settled across the water, and the silence between us felt very different from the silence that had separated us for 10 years. Back then, it was filled with anger, misunderstanding, and pain. Now it was filled with reflection. I stared at the fading sunlight and thought about everything my mother had told me. Part of me wished she had trusted me enough to tell the truth years earlier. Part of me understood why she had not. Grief changes people. Fear changes people. Sometimes love itself can lead people to make decisions that hurt the very people they are trying to protect. My mother wiped her eyes and looked down at her hands. "There was not a single day that passed without me thinking about you," she said quietly. "Every birthday, every holiday, every time I drove past your room." Her voice trembled. "I followed your career from a distance whenever I could. Newspaper articles, business interviews, community announcements. I kept every one of them." I turned toward her in surprise. She smiled sadly. "You thought I stopped caring. I never did." Hearing those words released something I had been carrying for years. The anger that once felt permanent suddenly seemed much smaller. Not because the past no longer mattered, but because I finally understood it. We sat together until the stars began appearing overhead. We talked about my father. We talked about the years we lost. We talked about mistakes, regrets, and second chances. By the end of the conversation, neither of us could change what happened, but we could decide what happened next. The following morning, I returned to the community center for another project meeting. News of the previous evening's presentation had spread throughout the region. Residents continued discussing the development plans, but many conversations focused on something else entirely. The story of a local girl leaving town with nothing and returning years later as a successful business leader had captured people's attention. Throughout the day, dozens of residents approached me. Some shared memories from my childhood. Others thanked me for investing in the town. Several admitted they had underestimated me years ago. I accepted every conversation with gratitude. Success had taught me something important. The greatest victories are not the moments when others finally recognize your worth. The greatest victories are the moments when you no longer need their approval. Later that afternoon, the development committee hosted a public gathering outside the renovated town square. Hundreds of residents attended. Local businesses set up booths. Families filled the sidewalks. Children played near the fountain. It felt less like a formal event and more like a celebration of the community's future. As speeches concluded, the committee chairperson unexpectedly invited me to say a few final words. Standing before the crowd, I looked across the familiar faces. 10 years earlier, many of these same people watched me leave during one of the most painful nights of my life. Now they were watching me return. The difference was not the suit I wore. It was not the company I built. It was not the success I achieved. The real difference was who I had become along the way. I thanked the community for welcoming the project and spoke about opportunity, resilience, and perseverance. Then I shared something deeply personal. I explained that setbacks do not determine a person's future. Rejection does not determine a person's future. Difficult beginnings do not determine a person's future. What matters is the decision to keep moving forward even when the path seems impossible. The crowd responded with warm applause. As I stepped away from the microphone, I noticed my mother standing near the front. Our eyes met. This time, there was no distance between us. No unanswered questions. No decade of silence. Only understanding. Later that evening, before leaving town, I stopped once more in front of my childhood home. The porch looked exactly as it had in my memories. Yet the feeling was completely different. 10 years ago, I walked away believing I had lost everything. Now I understood that the journey which began on that rainy night had shaped every success that followed. Some endings arrive disguised as heartbreak. Some departures become beginnings. And sometimes, after years of searching, you finally discover that coming home is not about returning to a place. It is about finding peace with the story that brought you there.